this is the third of these three basic Marxist economics sessions. We did the law of value, which is obviously key to the basis of understanding Marxist economics. And then the law of accumulation, which dealt with how capital is accumulated from the exploitation of workers and turned into money, into commodities, and then back into money so that capitalists can make a profit, and how they accumulate and build up that wealth over a period of time at the expense of the working class, leading to the development of a reserve army of unemployed and to generally holding wages down relative to profits. So there's a rising inequality in modern capitalist economies. This third session is what I call the law of profitability, what Marx called the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And it's a particularly controversial session because the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which appears in Capital Volume 3 mostly, does not appear in Capital Volume 1 or in Capital Volume 2, which of course you've all read thoroughly. So we've moved on to Capital Volume 3, and here, Volume 3, which was compiled from a load of notes and documents that Marx left on his death in the cupboards and desks, and Engels had to take them out along with Marx's daughter and convert them into what we call Volume 3 of Capital from those notes and documents. And that's why Engels constructed this. And part of Volume 3 deals with this law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And I've singled it out as one of the most important laws of economic development, or the capitalist laws of motion, that Marx developed. It's found in chapters 13, chapters 15 of Volume 3 of Capital. And it's controversial because, as you'll find out, I would say the majority of Marxist economists do not accept this law either as being valid or being relevant, and certainly not to provide us with any explanation of why there are general crises in the capitalist production process, which, in my view, the law attempts to explain and is the basis for the best explanation of crises in capitalism. But let me just now share some graphs with you and take you through the basics of the law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall. Marx's economics number 3, the law of profitability. Now, this is what Marx said in Grundrisse, which was the notes that he wrote, which Engels also used, but existed and were only published really in the middle of the 20th century, at least in English. And in Grundrisse, which just means notes, basically, in every respect, the most important law of modern political economy and the most essential for understanding the most difficult relations is the law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall. It's the most important law from an historical standpoint, meaning that it explains the development of capitalism, and it's a law from which, despite its simplicity, has never before been grasped and even less consciously articulated. So Marx is telling us that although the rate of profit can be found and observed to fall, he has developed an understanding of why that is the case, and it's very important historically to understand, and it's never really been properly developed before by anybody else, other economists before him. And he says in Volume 3, in chapter 15, the rate of profit is key. It's the motive power of capitalist production. Profitability of the investment that capitalists make is key to driving them to make that investment. Things are only produced only as long as they can be produced for a profit. And that's something we discussed already in the previous sessions. So when we get to the simple formula, which is what I want to deal with now, the actual rate of profit. What is the rate of profit? Well, the rate of profit, according to Marx, is based in this formula above, and I'll explain what each item is, S over C plus V. And if we look at the first, capitalist starts with money to invest in, And he invests, as we saw in session 2, in means of production, fixed capital and raw materials, which he calls circulating capital because it circulates during the process of production and then disappears. Fixed capital stays at the end of production. Some of it has depreciated, machines, the factories and so on, but we still have it for the next process of production. Adding all that together, we get what Marx called constant capital, and that's the C and the denominator here for the rate of profit. Now, labor force, capitalist invests in the labor force to produce the commodities. It pays wages, and of course, the labor force produces more value than it pays in wages, so Marx called that variable capital. So the total amount of investment the capitalist makes with money to start production can be considered on the bottom line, C plus V, gives you the amount invested by the capitalists. The labor force produces commodities that contain surplus value, and that's above their own value in wages paid. And as we saw in session 1, that produces surplus value, a surplus over and above what the workforce gets in wages. And that surplus value we could consider is the profit the capitalist makes. If it doesn't happen, they're not going to make that investment. So the rate of profit is that surplus value divided by the total amount invested. So it's not the mass of profit, that's just the S, that's the total surplus value that the capitalist gets from the production out of the workers. It's the rate of profit, that S divided by the amount that the capitalist has invested. And the key to understanding this law is to remind ourselves of the previous 2 laws. First of all, that the first law, which is the law of value, says that only labor creates value. And the second law was that the capitalists will accumulate more capital over time, and this will take the form of a rise in the value of investment in the means of production, the factories, the raw materials, over the investment in labor power. What Marx called, as we saw in the second session, the organic composition of capital. So only labor creates value, and the second law says that the organic composition of capital will rise. So if we go back to the formula, the rate of profit is S over C plus V. And here's the trick. If we divide the S, the C and the V by the value of labor power, which is the V, we get on the top line S over V. What's that? Well, that's the rate of exploitation. It's the amount of profit made out of the employment of workers. So it's a rate of exploitation. What's on the bottom line? On the bottom line is C over V plus 1. Ignore the 1. So the C over V is the organic composition of capital. The investment in the organic composition of capital means that there's more C than V, but that is the ratio of the organic composition of capital. So the rate of profit will vary depending on whether C over V rises faster than S over V. You can see that. So if the bottom line rises faster than the top line, then the rate of profit falls. So that is the general position of the law of profitability, that C over V will rise faster. It's the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. But there are times when the top line rises faster than the bottom line. So when the rate of exploitation outstrips the growth in the organic composition of capital. This is what Marx called the countertendency. It isn't the dominant tendency, it's not the tendency, but it's a counteracting factor to the overall tendency. So the law of profitability says that this ratio will fall over time because the rate of exploitation will grow more slowly than the organic composition of capital over time. Or, if you like it the other way around, this could fall faster than this could fall. But historically, the organic composition of capital is generally rising all the time. And so only the counteracting factor of a faster rise in the rate of exploitation would lead to a rise in the rate of profit. That's the law. So let's consider the tendencies and the countertendencies. The tendency is that the law as such says a rising organic composition of capital will outstrip any rise in the rate of exploitation or surplus value. That's the general tendency. But there are counter tendencies Marx outlines in those chapters that I mentioned in Volume 3. sometimes the rate of surplus values we've seen can outstrip the rise in the organic composition of capital. How would that happen? That would mean, and the best period I can give you is what they like to call the neoliberal period, the period from the early 1980s up to the end of the 20th century, when the rate of exploitation by privatization, holding down wages, destruction of trade unions, deregulation of the economy, forced up the rate of exploitation, the rate of surplus value, faster than the increase in the organic composition of capital. So there was actually a rise in the rate of profit in most countries between the early 1980s to the end of the 20th century. But this does not last forever. That's Marx's argument. This counter-tendency cannot last forever, and eventually the organic composition of capital will outstrip any rise in the rate of surplus value. Very simply, there are only 24 hours in a day. There's only a certain number of workers. If you maximize that, that's the end of it. You can't increase the rate of surplus value anymore, but you can always go on investing in new machinery and factories and building up the organic composition of capital in order to try and boost profits. And sometimes another counter tendency is that the introduction of new technology is actually cheaper than the old technology you were using. So the organic composition of capital falls because the value of the new technology, of new constant capital, is lower than it was before. So whereas you used a mainframe computer 10 years, 20 years ago with huge cost, now you can use a time PC like we now, which is much less than the cost. And so that appears to be a cheapening of the cost of new technology that can do the same thing that the big mainframe did before. But of course, what happens is there's a huge expansion of all the little PCs, so everybody's got them. So there's a huge increase in each unit. Technology might be smaller in cost, but there's a huge increase in the numbers of those units, and that therefore the technology and its cost rises. So the organic composition of capital will most of the time continue to rise. Then sometimes if you can speed up the process of production, so you can turn over the workers' time, and you can turn over the machinery you're using at a much faster pace, you can counteract the tendency for the rate of profit to fall by an increase in the profit in the same period of time. And then you can invest in what Marx called fictitious capital. Rather than investing in the real economy, if you like, in productive assets, workers in factories and on producing goods and services that people need, you speculate in the stock market to compensate for a falling rate of profit in the productive sector. That's been a big factor in the last 25, 30 years, the increase in speculation in the stock market and the bond market and financial assets in general to compensate for the fall in the rate of profit. And then you can trade and invest abroad. Key factor, of course, for countries in the advanced capitalist world, the imperialist world, is that they can send their investments, both of machinery and factories and so on, and technology abroad, and then use cheap labor abroad to get a boost in the rate of profit. So the rate of profit in the so-called global south will be higher than the rate of profit in the imperialist countries. So there's a movement of capital into those areas to compensate for the fall in the rate of profit, the tendency of the fall in the rate of profit. So we have the tendency, and we have all these various counter-tendencies. But as far as Marx is concerned, these counter-tendencies cannot hold out indefinitely to stop the rate of profit to fall over time historically. So you could say that question is posed then, is this law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall just a long-term tendency? Does it just spread out over decades and decades gradually and doesn't really have any other effect apart from gradually falling and demonstrating that capitalism has got a problem over time? Or does it actually cause crises and booms and slumps? Now, my argument, and this will be opposed by many Marxist economists, if not all, some Marxist economists say that it's just a long-term tendency and doesn't have any effect on crises. Others say that it's a crises factor and hasn't got a long-term tendency. I think it's both. Let me start by giving you some evidence. Here's some empirical evidence about the world rate of profit. This is a measure of the world rate of profit drawn up by an Argentine economist and adopted by myself. He goes back to 1859. He takes 14 countries, averages out the rate of profit in those 14 countries, And here you get the long-term position on the rate of profit of capital in 14 major economies of the world. And you can see that over the period of, 180 years, we can see a fall in the rate of profit on capital, up around 40% in the period of the 1880s, a bit of a recovery in the period leading up to the First World War. Wars seem to produce high rates of profit. You ought to think about that question. Then we get a big fall in the Great Depression of the rate of profit, and then a recovery in the Second World War, and what we call the Golden Age, which is when I was a young man. The rate of profit was good, growth was good, investment was good, employment was better than it was, at least in the advanced countries, of course, not in the so-called colonial world at the time. That's the Golden Age, but you can still see that the Golden Age didn't have a rate of profit for those 14 economies that matched what it was like over then 70 or 80 years earlier. Then we had the huge profitability crisis in the 1970s, and then what I just talked about, the neoliberal recovery, we get a very small recovery, still weak. Well, the hell that workers around the world went through from the 1980s up until the end of the century in order for capitalism to get its counteracting tendencies to drive the rate of profit up just by that small amount. And you can see as we go into the 21st century, we're now probably at the lowest level in the rate of profit in the history of industrial capitalism, at least, or capitalism in general. So Marx's law, this tendency of the rate of profit fall, is not just a tendency, it's borne out in reality over the long term. But how does that fit to the question of whether it causes anything to do with crises in capitalism? And the argument here is that the counter-tendencies will tend to stop the rate of profit falling in a straight line, but they don't last very long. And then the period begins when there's a accumulation process reaches a point where the rate of profit starts to fall sufficiently to cause a crisis in investment and production for the capitalists. So if we look at the right-hand side, here we are in a boom, everything's going fine, then the rate of profit falls and eventually leads to a fall in the mass of profit, the total profit. So instead of just being a fall in S over C plus B, now the actual S starts falling, and there's a production crisis because now capitalists are earning less profit than they were before every time they invest. So they'll stop investing very quickly. So there's a collapse in investment, employment and consumption, and what a realization. In other words, workers have been laid off, so they can't buy all the goods anymore. Capitalists are closing down their factories, or they can't make a profit, so they're not buying from other capitalists. There's a lack of effective demand. This can trigger a financial collapse in the stock market, banks, housing bubbles, and so on. It varies from each crisis. And eventually that collapse reduces the bottom of the line of S over C plus B. The C plus B falls because capitalists have closed down a lot of their factories, or they've merged together, reduced costs, laid off a lot of workers. So the rate of profit starts to rise, and then profits begin to recover. And as they recover, then the process of capitalist production resumes. So we get a cyclical factor. So it's not just a long-term factor. We get a cyclical process within this long-term factor caused by this law operating. Now, I want to take a few criticisms of this law by Marxists. Now, this is Nobuo Okishio, who's a Japanese Marxist economist. And in the 1980s, he made a critique of Marx's law of profitability. So it's a Marxist critique, not a bourgeois critique, not one from the mainstream. We would just ignore this law anyway. And Okishio says, well, hold on a moment. No capitalist would invest in new technology unless it increased his rate of profit. What would be the point of investing in new technology if it didn't increase the rate of profit? So if their rate of profit fell, they wouldn't employ the new technology. So this law can't be right. How can capitalism work on the basis of increasing new technology and have a falling rate of profit? Surely that wouldn't apply. Each capitalist wouldn't invest if they couldn't make an increase in their rate of profit. Well, the reply to that was actually outlined in Marx's volume 3, but I'll just briefly go over it. Other people have mentioned it. Yes, the first capitalist steals a march on the others by lowering the cost of production, introducing a new technology, and against the prevailing market price, it can get an increase in profits. So its profitability goes up. But the only reason its profitability is going up is because it's really taking the profits and market share of other capitalists who don't have this new technology. So they lose ground, they lose more profit, or their rate of profit falls, while the innovating capitalist profit rises. And now the others must react. So they introduce the same new technology or even better technology to lower their costs too. So the result of this process is there's an increase in the productivity of the labor force because new technology is being introduced. So the value of that commodity falls, the prices will tend to fall, it lowers the value per unit, but it also means that the profitability of all the capitalists will fall because everybody is now using the same technologies. Once they've all adopted the new technology, the organic composition of capital, that's the ratio of money spent on equipment versus wages, will have risen, and other things being equal, the general rate of profit will fall. So yes, an individual capitalist, number one, gains more profit. The second capitalist comes in, they gain more profit because they had to react against the first capitalist. And the third and fourth ones are going to have to be forced to come in and use that, get that new technology. They're going to get more profit, but only gradually they will get less and less. And eventually, when everybody's got it, there's no increase in profitability. And in fact, a huge increase in technology relative to labor is going to lead to a general fall in the rate of profit. So that's Marx's general answer. You could call it what we call the fallacy of composition. So the Mercatio argument is a fallacy of composition. It sums up the gain of one individual capitalist, and since that's the basis of the whole capitalist economy. But what seems good for each individual capitalist is not good for the profitability of the whole system, because when everybody introduces the new technology, overall profitability falls. So what's good for one isn't good for the sum of all the parts. Moreover, as Marx would say, each individual capitalist is not doing this voluntarily, as Mercatio argues, but of the necessity to compete and not lose market share. As Marx says, then the law of value and profitability operates behind the backs of the capitalists. It's not in their conscious control to get increased profits. They're forced to invest in methods to try and increase their profitability, but at the expense of the overall reduction in the profitability of the capitalist economy as a whole. Another argument is that, yes, well, the rate of profit falls, but the mass of profit goes up. That's surely more important than the rate of profit. Who cares whether I'm getting 6% on my investment when I'm still getting $100? Maybe the next year it's 4% on the investment, but I'm still getting more money because the mass of profit has risen because I'm getting that 4% on whatever I've invested. So there's an increase in the mass of profit. So how isn't that more important? Well, it's true. Marx said there's a double edge here to the law. As the rate of profit falls, it's perfectly possible, it's most likely that the mass of profit, that S will rise. So S over C plus B is the rate, but that could fall, but the S could still be rising, but the rate could be falling because C plus B on the bottom line is rising more, but there's still a rise in the mass. So the mass of profit can rise and will rise as the rate of profit falls, keeping capitalist investment reduction going. But as the rate of profit falls, the increase in this mass of profit must eventually fall to the point of what Marx called absolute overaccumulation, and a tipping point for crisis, namely when the mass of profit no longer rises anymore if they invest more. Capitalists must stop investing because they find that they're not making more profit by that extra unit of investment. And if we look at crises in the United States in the second half of the 20th century, and we see what the situation was, empirically, we can see here that we've got the rate of profit is the dark black line, and you can see in 1958 that the rate of profit fell just before the 58 slump by 14%, but so did the mass of profit by over 8%. And each of those successive recessions saw a similar position where the rate of profit is accompanied eventually by a fall in the mass of profit, and that's key to achieving it. If we just had a fall in the rate of profit and no fall in the mass of profit, there wouldn't have been a slump. But you have to have the two together. So the double edge appears. You get both the rate and the mass falling in a situation where there's a slump. So let me summarize some of the Marxist views about the causes of crisis. This is the Marxist law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall, which I argue can provide an explanation for crises and slumps in capitalism. But the majority view of Marxists doesn't hold to this view. They say that the cause of slumps is usually a lack of effective demand. And the two ways that could be is through underconsumption. In other words, workers don't have enough money to buy all the goods that the capitalists are producing. Or it could be that there's too much investment by the capitalists. They're investing in new capital goods, new technology, and they haven't really thought about the ability to get that bought and sold on the market. So there's a disproportion between the accumulation of investment and the ability of either capitalists or workers to buy all that investment. Investment outstrips consumption and causes a disproportion and a slump. That's one side of the argument. This is actually, on the left-hand side, is the majority view of most Marxists. On the other side, there is the lack of profits theory, which, in my view, is much closer to the explanation of crises under capitalism. As we saw in the law of value section, it's profit that matters for capitalists, and that is what the whole purpose is about. If they're getting profit, then the situation is okay. If they're not getting profit, as Marx said at the beginning, then the driving force for capitalism comes to an end. There are two ways in which the profits could be lacking. One argument used in the past was profit squeeze. Workers drive up their wages too much, squeeze the capitalist profits and force them to stop production and investment, the profit squeeze explanation. That argument, I don't think, has got much empirical validity to it, because usually the process of the workers' wages rising doesn't happen until there's a slump already. And therefore we fall back in the bottom right-hand corner with the idea that I presented to you, the law of profitability, or the falling rate profit theory. But as I say, I would say that if you wanted me to break down the Marxist economists, and of course there's only about 10 of us in the whole world, if you wanted to break it down, then probably 7 of them think this, 2 of them think that, nobody thinks that anymore, and there's 1 of us over here. So that gives you an idea of where we're at. Let me just briefly go through the criticisms we might make of the underconsumption theories. And I'm not going to make these criticisms. I'm going to leave it to Marx and Engels to do so. Marx says it's sheer tautology to say that crises are caused by the scarcity of effective consumption. That commodities are unsaleable means that no effective purchasers have been found for them. So it's obvious. You're saying, look, yes, a crisis is when things can't be bought. Nobody will buy anything. But that doesn't tell you why the crisis is caused. It just tells you that is the slump. That's the nature of the slump. And to give this tautology the semblance of profounder justification, says Marx, by saying that the working class receives too small a portion of its own product, and the evil will be remedied as soon as it receives a larger share of it and its wages increase as a consequence. One can only remark, this is important, that crises are always prepared precisely in a period when wages are generally rising and the working class actually gets a larger share of the product going for consumption. And Engels makes a similar comment. The underconsumption of the masses is not a new phenomenon. It's existed as long as they've been exploiting classes. The underconsumption has been a constant feature of history for thousands of years, but a surplus of production is a phenomenon only of the last 50 years. The underconsumption of the masses may be a prerequisite condition of crises, but it doesn't tell us why crises exist today when they did not exist before. And if we look at the empirical evidence, here I give you an example. In every US recession since 1945, it's not been a fall in the household consumption levels that has emerged before a slump, but a fall in the business investment levels. If you look at the right-hand graph, you can see that the blue block is personal consumption. That's the consumption by American households 1 year before each slump. And you can see there was hardly any fall in household consumption prior to the slump 1 year later. In fact, in one recession, there was actually an increase. What about GDP? Well, that falls a bit 1 year before, so that must be an indication. But the biggest indicator and driver of the slump was a huge drop in business investment, the green block. 10%, 14%, 20%. In the Great Recession, 30%, 1 year before, not in the slump, but 1 year before. And yet, throughout the period of before the slump and during the slump, consumption hardly drops because households have to go on paying for energy, food, and basics. But the capitalists have decided they're not going to invest anymore because of the situation with the massive profit and the rate of profit. The second big Marxist theory is disproportion, as I said. The argument is that the investment sector outstrips the consumption sectors. So capitalists go on investing in factories and new technology and don't think about the fact that households are not going to buy the goods they're producing. This causes an imbalance and a lack of demand for goods. But actually, in capitalist economies, investment is always outstripping consumption. If you look at the figures, there's always a faster growth in investment than in consumption. This disproportion is permanent. So it can't be the cause of recurrent crises of booms and slumps. It's a feature that investment is always outstripping consumption under capitalism. So, and then Marx would say, even if investment and consumption were actually in alignment, that wouldn't stop crises because it's the profitability and what's happening to profitability that matters, not whether investment and consumption are in alignment. This disproportion theory, by the way, mainly comes from volume 2 in Capital, where some Marxists, like Rosa Luxemburg and others, have misinterpreted Marxist theories to suggest, or have amended it to argue that the cause of crisis is the lack of consumption relative to investment, which forces capitalism into crisis, or to developing consumption by looking abroad through imperialism. That was Luxemburg's argument. No time to deal with that now. Now, the other more modern theories that Marx has put forward is there's too much debt in the economy. This causes financial instability. This is not really a Marxist theory, but it's dominant amongst Marxists who talk about financialization, too much debt, financial instability in the banks, and so on. All I can give you is a couple of quotes again from Marx in volume 3. If the credit system appears as the principal lever of overproduction and excessive speculation, this is simply because the reproduction process, that's the investment process going on in the productive sector, which is elastic by nature, is now forced to its most extreme limit. In other words, the credit system appears to be the basis of crises and slumps, as we saw, say, in 2008-9, but in reality, it's because the reproduction process is in deep trouble. And as he says in Theories of Surplus Value, which is, by the way, called volume 4 in some places, crises are possible without credit. If credit doesn't decide whether there's a crisis, that depends on the profitability of capital itself. So that's basically the law of the tendency rate of profit to fall. I leave you with this further reading, which, and if you did get the opportunity to look at the little YouTube 10-minute video I sent by the Cranfield Institute of Management, they actually sum up the law of profitability in 10 minutes, much better and more clearly than I've just done. There we are.